Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Heartbound Editing Podcast. I am Rebecca Hartwell, and I am the developmental editor behind Heartbound Editing. It is my goal to help authors turn their stories into bestsellers or masterworks that can change their world. Today's guest is Freida Kilmari, the author of Cinderella, and I am going to let her introduce herself and her books. Hello, Freida.
Hi, my name's Freida Kilmari. I write queer fantasy romance across all different kinds of sexualities and gender identities. And as mentioned, I'm releasing Cinderella this August. It's a sapphic steampunk Cinderella retelling, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Very cool. So, yeah, do you want to maybe spell out the title for folks who are listening to this? Because I know that you spelled Cinderella in a really cool way that ties into so many different aspects of your story.
Yeah, I did spell it a bit differently. I spelled Cinderella Cinder31la.
And how does that connect into your book without spoiling too much?
Cinderella works in a kind of failing garage in a really kind of poverty-stricken part of the main city in the book. And one day, a certain someone stumbles into the garage and she only has 31 days to live.
Very cool setup. So, I would love to dive in a little bit. I know you have 5 books, soon to be 6 with this one already released. How did you get into writing? What brought you to this wild career that we've both chosen?
Wild is definitely the right choice career. Um, I've always been a big reader. I was a hyperlexic kid, so I started reading really, really early. Um, I have a distinct memory of telling my mum when I was a toddler to stop reading aloud because I was reading faster than what she was reading, which is it's like my earliest memory. I think I started writing most as a teenager, and then I kind of got more into writing stories and stuff as I got a little bit older. I started writing YA when I was like 19, 20. I still have some really old YA manuscripts that have never seen the light of day on my hard drive. Um, and I released my first romance novel in 2020, I think. It was about 3 years into my editing career. So
Very
now I
cool.
do.
So, did the editing come first, or did that come out of the writing?
No, the editing came first for me.
Okay, very cool. I would also love to ask, I came to writing very intentionally. I wasn't like you where I was writing for a while before I wanted to start publishing. Do you think you're ever going to revisit the untouched drafts that you have from way back when? Do you think you're going to try to repurpose concepts, or are they just set aside for eternity?
I love the idea of like reusing them. They don't fit my brand now, writing
Mm,
adult romance, being YA. Branding's kind of important for an author. So
yeah.
I'd have to kind of redraft them. I'm not the biggest fan of the editing process,
Ah,
especially the story editing process. I don't like it.
is
I
that
can't.
just on your books, or does that apply to helping others?
When I first started as a freelance editor, I offered developmental editing for like 2 years,
Mhm.
and I hated it. Couldn't stand it. And I quickly gave up. It felt to me a little bit like I was trying to persuade an author into making something a lot more genre specific and them just
Mhm.
disagreeing with me at every turn.
Interesting. All right. So, what drew you to the more adult romance over the YA stuff that you'd started with?
That's a reading preference.
Mm.
I think I was like 22, 23 when I accidentally picked up Witch's Rebel by Sarah Piper.
Okay.
It's a very good series. Very urban fantasy kind of high heat reverse harem kind of book, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't read the blurb. I was an instant cover buy.
Love
And
it.
before that, I had only read things like the last romancy thing I had read was like things in the Twilight era.
Okay.
So it was a bit of a jump. And I never looked back.
Very cool. So, within that genre, what are some of the tropes that you find yourself drawn to over and over or particularly enjoy writing?
I am one of those weirdos who really, really likes things that provide romantic tension. It's not popular at the moment. People seem to dislike things like miscommunication and things that
Mhm.
provide really kind of excess angst, but I happen to really like it. I find it really dramaful. My own life is lovely and relaxing. So if I want drama, I have to read or watch it.
Fair. I very much agree with you on that. I live for the breakup and figuring out how they can get back together and all of I'm a drama person too. So you mentioned earlier, and obviously I loved the Cinderella story that I got to read for you in the developmental age stages and now as an ARC reader. How did you get into the sort of LGBTQ arena of adult romance?
That's probably another reading preference I would say. I am queer myself, so I guess there's always that. It's
Yeah.
always that side of things. But like most people, I assume you kind of start off reading very heteronormative romance. That's what sells, at least sold mostly on bookstore shelves when I was younger. It's diversifying a bit now, but and then I can't remember the first queer romance novel I read. I wish I had a title, but I don't know what it is. And I just stumbled into, I think it was probably a reverse harem that had queer content in,
Okay.
and then found out that I seemed to have quite a preference for poly with queer content, and then went in search of
Mhm.
queer specific romance novels from there.
Gotcha. Very cool. So the first author that I ever interviewed on the podcast was another steampunk author, and the two styles that the two different authors, you and her, have are fascinating to me. I tend to lean more in the fantasy side of things rather than steampunk, and I would just love to hear like what drew you to that particular world setting and the technology versus magic sort of considerations around that.
So technology versus magic, I've noticed seems to be something my brain gets stuck on. It's not a conscious choice. Fifth Horseman, for example, my debut series, it's a futuristic urban fantasy. So it has magic fueled technology, things like translational book screens and um like technological portals and stuff fueled by magic. And the magic has a lot of like science behind it. Very clearly, I really quite like explainable magic. In terms of steampunk specifically, my first introduction to steampunk was when I was editing something called Towers of the Earth by Nita Round. And I knew of steampunk, but I'd never really read or engaged with one before. And then I read Cinder by Marissa Mayer, which I do think draws quite a lot of parallels to Cinderella, but there are some similarities there. And then there's Arcane on Netflix, the TV show. That's very cool as well. And I just realized that I'm someone who loves world building. I'll always be writing romance because the tension, the drama is great. But in terms of backdrops, world building is like my second favorite thing to do. So I'm always going to want to create these really unique, kind of fun worlds that you don't see very often.
Awesome. Very cool. And I feel like that comes through beautifully in the story. I loved picking up little bits and pieces everywhere, and it all felt so unique and just vivid and contrasted and vibrant. It was so cool. So let's shift into talking a little bit more about your process. Are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? What does that end up looking like for you? And how do you feel it comes out in the finished first draft?
I am like what it would be like if you tried to give a set of instructions to a 3-year-old.
Okay. Elaborate.
So I love research. I'm a bit of a bookworm. I love researching. I've got so many books above my head here, like things like the history of zodiac usage and the history of the pirate age. I love research with mythologies and legends and magic and stuff, but so that happens in quite a strategic way because I like that side of things. And then I go to write my structure and it sits there and it's neat. And I've spent hundreds of hours on this structure and this magic system and this world building. And then my characters enter the fray and they tear it to pieces and go in a completely different direction. And so by the time the first draft is done, they've left me a lovely mess that I have to clean up.
I love it. So, do you feel like your stories are primarily character first, despite how much you love doing the world building?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's probably another reading preference. There's nothing wrong with plot-driven stories. They're great. They're not really my thing. Interestingly, I prefer plot-driven movies.
Interesting. Yeah, I've noticed that people will often have at least a small difference in their taste in books versus movies, and I'm a big one for that. Like I read fairly critically and I have high standards for the stuff that I read, and then watching TV, it's just like, nope, I'm going on vibes. That's all I care about.
I am completely the opposite way around. I go completely on vibes and moods for books, and then I watch TV either because I'm stressed and I want to watch something stupid and lame to rest my brain,
Yeah,
or completely by like practical choice.
fascinating. Cool. So, how do you feel that being an editor and having the developmental editor experience in the past influences your own writing process?
Yeah, it means I'm very aware that my attack on the world of book structure um, is untraditional and people don't like it. Some readers either really enjoy my very wandering style or they get bored with it quite quickly.
Hmm.
It's one or the other. And when I was releasing Fifth Horseman, it gave me quite an identity crisis as an author.
Really?
I really
How so?
wanted the whole reason I chose to start writing Cinderella in the first place was because I wanted to give myself something that was slightly more plot focused to practice my skill at plotting. It's the whole
Mm.
reason for writing it. It was a skill development. I didn't actually expect to be very good at it or it to form something I was going to publish. Um, and writing Cinderella has taught me that I'm just okay with being a bit wandery, maybe a little bit more gold and directioned, but I quite like being quite wandery on my way to get there.
Fair. Cool. So, if your editing process isn't necessarily to reduce that meandering feeling, what are the biggest things that you are generally doing in your initial self-revision process?
I have quite the story editing process before it reaches any kind of line edits. Obviously, I go through it first. That's probably a very wise and normal first step. Um, I do my best to make sure that everything makes sense. I often, Cinderella was terrible for this. I wrote it over like a period of 4 years in different periods of my life. So like I would take like a break for like a year between writing it, which meant that when I got to finishing the first draft, it was in pieces. There was so much, there was so much world building holes and things that didn't make any sense. It then goes to my alpha reading team, who who generally their entire job is to be lovely and encouraging. Before handing it to my beta reader team, whose entire job is to be as critical as they can to poke as many holes. So I have alpha teams specifically there to make me feel better about the process that's about to become.
I think that's a fabulous way to view it and use it. And yeah, having some encouragement before it starts getting torn apart can make a very big difference in being receptive to the more critical feedback.
Since my world building is quite logical, it means there's holes everywhere.
Ah.
If the moment you start going into building your world with logic in mind and a magic system that actually makes some believable sense,
Mhm.
people start cherry picking the holes. People start going, oh, but you've explained it like this over here, so down here doesn't make sense anymore.
Just out of curiosity, how many alpha readers and beta readers do you tend to work with?
My alpha team's quite small. There's only 5 of them. My alpha team have access to everything I'm writing as I'm going on
Mm.
Google Docs. So they only have view and comment access, of course, but their entire job is just to encourage me and be like, this sentence made me cry, or I'm a bit confused here, and stuff like that. Just kind of casual reader comments that you would make to yourself as you're actually reading a book. My beta reading, I don't have a beta reading team. I've thought about it a few times. I usually just use various Facebook groups that specifically look for betas. The only thing I make sure to do is make sure to pick readers that actually like the genre.
Mm.
Early on in my career, I made that error, and you end up picking up readers that don't read romance, so don't understand how character-driven romance is. They're
Gotcha.
like, there's no plot. The romance is the plot. That's why it's called romance.
It's in the name. It's in the name.
Yeah.
So, what do you feel is the biggest change at any stage with Cinderella that you ended up making between your first draft and the final that's going to publish at the end of the month?
There were lots of things I added into the final act to tie everything together a bit better. I changed where she gets her dress from for the ball at the end from. I made a change. I added an entire subplot at some
Cool.
point. I can't remember if it was before the development assessment or after it, but originally the subplot with Lapis and Lapis's soon to be husband wasn't in the original script. The stepsisters were just background. And I realized I'm not the biggest fan of that. I don't like characters as background. If you're going to have characters, especially ones that are actually supposed to be close to the main character, they should probably be there doing something. So I added this.
I agree with that assessment, and I'm happy to hear that you did that because I do remember that you had added it by the time I did my first read on it, and it was nice having that additional layer to it.
I think I added a couple of extra scenes, like a scene with a letter, and I added like a couple more things to it afterwards. But yeah, it was nice. I got a comment from, I can't think, it was a beta reader or maybe my line editor or someone in the process who said that they really enjoyed seeing how the growth between the relationship between Cinderella and the stepsisters, because typically in Cinderella retellings, they're evil through to the end,
Right.
but that's not quite the case here.
Did you get any feedback that you felt would have made a big change, but that you ended up rejecting ultimately because you didn't agree with the feedback or with the reviewer, or it just wasn't a direction that you wanted to go in?
There's always going to be feedback like that. And it's not, and it's almost never malicious. People that just have a cool idea, but that idea doesn't vibe well for you and isn't kind of what you see the novel in. I had someone who wanted me to add in this. It was a very good idea. I just didn't want to go with it. Who wanted me to have an entire third character point of view and have Zimeon chase them around the world in search of Ion, and then Zimeon would be able to be there in the kind of climax when they're in the Temple of Saren. And it's a really good idea. I don't disagree with that idea. I thought it was great. It would have added so much more dimension. You would have gotten world building and points of view from higher up. You see the
Yes.
entire world through Cinderella's point of view, which means you see it in quite a depressing light.
Sure. So why did you end up ultimately not using that idea?
It was a strategic decision. Generally speaking, in romance novels, you don't have points of view
Mm.
that aren't the romantic interest. And I didn't want people to be confused. If I all of a sudden have this male point of view character, people would think that they wouldn't know what direction the romance is going in. I didn't want people to mistake it for a heteronormative book, so I chose not to go for it.
Fair enough. Yeah, that is a very valid valid thing to pay attention to. So, not necessarily on this book, but in your author career, what do you feel is the biggest change that you did end up making that was just the hardest to accept or to convince yourself to do? And how do you feel about it after the fact?
There are two. One of them's a technical answer, and one of them's a really emotional answer. Fifth Horseman, there is one of the love interests is telepathic.
Mm.
So that means that they have lots of telepathic conversations in the book. And I originally wrote it in first person past tense, and it made the telepathy hard to transition into because the telepathy was in, was in present tense, and it was really jarring. I rewrote the entirety of the first two books into present tense. They were 120,000 words each. It took me months.
Oh my goodness. That's that's a
It
massive
was the
change.
worst
I applaud
decision.
you.
It was the worst decision I've ever made. The best decision I've ever made. It took me so long. It was awful. I do not regret it, but it was awful. And now, whenever I'm writing, I always make sure to write the first chapter in multiple different tenses and multiple different perspectives so that I never make that mistake again. I'm not doing it twice.
I love that approach. So do you then like compare and just feel out which one is feeling best for the book and then run with it going forward?
Yeah.
Fabulous. I love
You'll
it.
never have that issue if you do that.
I love it. I'm gonna start recommending that. That's fabulous. So what's the emotional answer?
The emotional answer, I killed a character off at the end of book 3.
Okay.
And it wasn't the character it was supposed to be.
Ah,
It
huh.
was supposed to be a different love interest, but he couldn't get his rubbish together in time to be the person I killed off, and so I had to change tactic. And the only one that made sense was to kill off my absolute favorite character, and it happens right at the end of book 3. So it's a cliffhanger ending, and then the first like 20% of the final book is their entire journey through grief, and it's the hardest thing I've ever had to write. And I wish it was the other character still. It's still really hard.
Oh no. So are you an author and a writer and a creative who feels like their characters are like living personalities that you are trying to interact with rather than creating or guiding?
Yeah. Do you know what? When I first started writing, I was one of those people that said, I don't understand how you do that. You're making up the characters, they belong in your head. And I'm absolutely one of those authors.
I would
Just
love to hear a little bit more about how that comes through in the work, how you approach it, and where that sense sort of came from and how it
I
has
definitely
continued.
think that if you write plot-driven narratives, I think it's easier to be more in control of your characters.
Mhm.
Because at that point, it's your plot that's getting away from you and being creative, and your characters are more tools to tell the plot. Whereas when you're writing character-driven narratives, that's not quite the same thing. You've given the plot, you've given the characters the complete control over the plot, like an idiot. You've handed them the magic key, which means all of a sudden your brain goes, hey, wouldn't this be a great idea? And so you write out this like 2,500 word scene and you realize this is a great idea, but I've got to go back and adjust everything. And it's really annoying. I've always said that writing is just a socially acceptable form of insanity.
I would agree with you there on just about every approach you can take to it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you're a plotter, a pantser, it's complete insanity. I don't think I'm the person who said that. I do think that I've got that quote from somewhere. Yeah,
I feel like I've heard it before, but that doesn't mean we can't agree with it out loud.
yeah, it's insane.
So, do you tend to rework things back, like you just mentioned, during the drafting process, or do you wait until you get to the end?
Yes, I do go back and edit as I go, which lots of people say not to do. I really struggle story editing my own work. Line editing and beyond, I'm totally fine with that. But
Mhm.
story editing, I really, really struggle with it. There is something about I can sit there and read it and analyze it, and I can take feedback. I can even make a jotted plan of what to do and when to do it and what order in which to do things in. But actually getting in there and rewriting a scene that already exists is something I find really hard to do, and I try to minimize the amount I have to do it.
Fair. What are some of your tools for minimizing that?
Um, I never end writing on the end of a chapter. I always make sure that I am in the middle of something and I end it there, partly because it's very good to keep you going because you really want to get to the end of the chapter and it keeps you writing, but also because it kind of forces you to read back through what you've just written because chances are you've slept between then and now. So, and you've forgotten all the details, and so you have to read back through and you find yourself naturally making small adjustments as you go. When you read, there's no way of not doing that. I don't believe people when they say they don't.
Well, I don't, but
Oh,
yeah,
there are
no,
just tiny adjustments as you read back through. Oh, this
I'm
is
I'm a very heavy like outliner and I do my sort of letting the story adjust where it needs to, letting the characters adjust where they need to in the outlining process. So by the time I'm drafting, I've already done a lot of those going back and adjusting and making sure things fit together differently. And I will always write from the beginning of a chapter to the end in one sitting. And I don't let myself reread a word that I wrote until I get to
that's
the
more discipline than I will ever have in my existence.
end. But part of the beauty of what we do is that everyone can just kind of play around and find what works for them because no one is going to have the exact same personality that I do or that you do. And the
I
fact that we
make
can
sure
find
I know the
processes.
ending every time. I do not start writing until I have the ending done because if you do not know the ending, you will go everywhere. You won't have a direction, and I'm telling you, it would be a hard time. Don't do it. Um,
Yeah.
So I always have an ending, and I generally know the main ups and downs along the way, the main points. So I could probably plot it on a big graph.
Mhm.
And I always have all of the world building and all of the magic system done, and all of like the outline of the character development, but not necessarily maybe the details that come out when you're individually writing the scene, that I tend to think probably happens when writing for most authors.
Fair. Cool. Very cool. So I know that you've talked about the structural stuff being the most difficult for you. If there are any authors listening who feel like they're in a similar boat where the structural stuff is just not clicking for them, it's their least favorite part, what piece of advice would you offer them?
A piece of advice that I'm sure developmental editors would hate me to give story structure is not everything. It's important. It is important. It is something that you should be paying attention to. You do want some variation of that rising action and a climax and some kind of resolution to your story. But it's not the be all end all, especially if you're writing something very character driven. It's okay to deviate. That's the whole point of creative writing. I mean, if you've ever picked up like a classic, like an Emily Bronte kind of book or something, you'll know that their structures were all over the place. They in a good way, but like they didn't adhere to very strict structural lines, and they're considered some of the greatest authors ever.
Cool.
So don't worry too much about it. That's my advice.
And as a line edit, are you a line editor or a
Yeah.
copy editor?
I'm a line editor. I kind of do them together at the same time, but I like to say that I'm a line editor because I focus on line editing.
Cool. So as a line editor, what piece of advice would you offer other authors?
Read.
Great.
And this is something that comes up in line editing, I think, more than any other kind of editing. For anyone listening who doesn't know the difference in types of editing, line editing focuses on writing style and readability, whereas copy editing focuses on grammar accuracy and consistency. And those are the two differences. And I feel like grammar is something that you can actively teach yourself. You can actively look up the rules as you go. You can take online grammar classes and brush up. And writing style is something that we very subconsciously absorb when we read. And I can always tell if an author reads widely or not. Things like knowing how to effectively paragraph, knowing to vary up your sentence lengths and structures to create tone. It's something that you don't even notice that you're picking up. You're not paying attention when you read, but you'll be able to do it when you write because you've read.
And just adding my perspective on that, because this is also something that I highly recommend, it will also help you pick up your genre expectations and what sort of characters or moments or tropes or emotions are expected from the readers that you are trying to write for. And reading is the only way that you're really going to internalize that stuff. You can look up, like, oh, what's expected in romance, but reading romance is going to help you write satisfying romance so, so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. Genre expectations are a big deal when you're an indie author. And a big
Yes.
deal for any author, I feel. But
I mean, literary tends to be a bit of an exception, but if you're writing genre fiction, indie or trad, yeah, it's huge.
and I say that because so many the indie market is not the same as traditional market. They don't, there's overlap, but they don't have the same audience. They don't have the same readership. That means that if you are basing your romance novel on stuff you've read from a bookstore shelf, that you're actually going to sell it to indie readers. I don't think that's the best strategy personally.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's important to read the authors that you would be next to in a lineup, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
right? So if you're going to be an indie author writing steampunk romance, you need to go find other indie authors writing steampunk romance and read their stuff and befriend them and everything else that you can do to understand what they are already doing so that you can emulate it.
I don't typically run into that problem because queer fantasy romance is not something that sits on a bookstore shelf very often. So I don't typically run into that problem. Almost all of the examples of mine are indie, just by default.
Fair enough. Yeah, I feel like the sort of magic or steampunk with romance space leans more heavily indie than a lot of other genres, such as, let's say, thriller, which can be a fun space to be in if you're writing in those already indie heavy spaces.
Absolutely. Reverse harem is exactly the same. It's
Yeah.
almost exclusively an indie genre. That is slowly changing. I've seen that change just in my time, in my last few years. That'll become a bookstore genre eventually.
Fascinating.
Getting there.
So I would love to talk a little bit about the post-creative process. You mentioned when I reached out asking if you'd like to come on the podcast that you are doing a blog tour. And I will admit that this is something I know very little about and would love it if you'd be willing to talk about just sort of your processes, some of the priorities you have in that, and how it works to help get your book out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I always split marketing into active and passive marketing. So active marketing being things like Facebook ads and Amazon ads that you can quite literally measure. They give you the metric, you know exactly what the click rate is. you know exactly how well that exact piece of marketing has done to help your sales. But you also have lots of passive marketing that I think often gets very ignored in publishing groups. Things like blog tours and social media posts, press copies, which I have in a box behind me. Haven't sent them out yet. All these things, I will never be able to tell you if it works.
Mm.
I'll never be able to sit there and tell you, yeah, this definitely increased my sales. I have no idea. But if you ever pay attention to how traditional publishers market work, they never just focus on things they can measure.
Mm.
Author presence, whether online or in person. I think in person's a little bit hard to do as an indie author or a small author publishing through any medium, really,
Mm.
is generally quite hard to do. But online presence is such an important part. And if you focus completely on your own platforms, so on your own social medias and your own newsletter lists, you're marketing the same thing again and again and again to the same set of people. So if you want to widen your platform and your reach, you're going to have to utilize ways in which to reach readers that aren't necessarily on your lists. So posting in other authors' Facebook groups, being able to release press copies to book talkers and bookstagrammers, being able to do blog tours and podcasts like this is a good way of expanding your audience.
Very cool. And how do you go about finding these people, these opportunities, these platforms?
Yeah, that's always going to be a lovely conundrum, I think, for any author. Finding them is it's like being in a maze. Um, I always recommend 20 books. 20 books to 50K or is a Facebook group. It's run